Welcome to the Theology Research News podcast. Theology Research News provides updates from KU Leuven's Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies to a worldwide academic audience. It features interviews with faculty members, discussions with visiting scholars, and updates about our publications, conferences, and other events. Please visit TRN at theologyresearchnews.com and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Today we feature a lecture by Joshua Calhoun on the occasion of the In Reader's Hands conference. Joshua Calhoun is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the title of his lecture is Absorbing the Word, Human Sin, Animal Sizing, and Textual Ecosystems.
So animals haunt not only the parchment, but also the paper leaves that we turn in archival libraries, and they record vital information that should matter to us if we care to understand book production, use, and survival in early modern Europe and beyond. By animal sizing, I mean the gelatinous, viscous mixture of rendered from boiled down animal parts and used to coat the surfaces of early handmade paper. Let's see if we... There we go. There's our boiled down animals. Animal sizing transformed the absorbent surface of handmade paper into a surface on which one could write with water-based inks. For without the aid of boiled down animal parts, early handmade paper was not viable as a writing substrate. In an issue of hand papermaking devoted to the importance of sizing for artisans across a span of centuries, Timothy Barrett shares a succinct definition of sizing that he learned as a young papermaker. Quote, sizing is a material added to paper to change its resistance to the penetration of liquid. I'll put that up on the board in a moment. By bonding with paper's plant fibers, animal sizing created a surface capable of mediating a writer's ideas in the form of clean lines of handwriting. Quality handmade writing paper then and now allows a writer to execute sharp, unfeathered ascenders, crossbars, and flourishes. Quick note of clarification. I am using these terms, and here's Tim Barrett's quote. I'm using these terms animal sizing, gelatin sizing, paper sizing, interchangeably, as does the literature on sizing. I default, however, to animal sizing, or I try to, because doing so reminds us of the hybrid nature of Renaissance texts and of what I would think of as eco-poetic negotiations involved in even the simplest acts of writing. So, without sizing, Jean Emberdy writes in 1693, quote, you could not one letter make, nor any mark upon the paper's back. Or, we might say, upon a printed book's margins, for that matter. Animal sizing, Emberdy's description suggests, is an affordance that sets limits on what it is possible to do with, around, or via the artifact. In this case, paper. It is also a feature added to paper, and when added to paper, that dramatically improves the paper's chance of long-term survival. It is therefore a feature that should be, but is not, accounted for in book survival estimates. And we can talk more about survival later. If we have time, we may not. But it really plays in survival, which would be another part of this. Studies of the history of reading have generally taken for granted that readers could write in their books. We typically talk about whether a page is annotated or not. Are there manuscript annotations or not? And one thing I'm suggesting is that the first question we might ask is it annotatable? So we would ask about annotatability before we'd ask if it's annotated. To give you a couple, just again, I have a few slides up front to warm us up, and then some of them being silly. This is one way to visualize, to think about what unsized paper, it's made from rags. And part of what I really am trying to push back on in the book, or the nature of the page, is this idea that paper is made from rags. It's not true, or it is true in the sense that a burger is made from beef. Right? A cow died. It's a rag. Saying that paper is made from rags is to speak euphemistically about an interaction with the natural world, about resource extraction. That said, for our sake, to understand it today, once we get to the point where we're really, is it that bad already? And please, if that's your phone call from the airline, please take it. Yeah, let's cross our fingers. If we think about the paper that's made from rag fibers, and of course you've all been working with these papers, maybe you had that experience of thinking the first time you touched it, you would rip it to pieces and it would fall apart, and you notice how sturdy it is. But if it's also a cloth-based substrate, imagine taking a quill pen or your Lamy pen and putting it in your pocket without a pocket protector, and it's going to soak like that. Another way to think about annotatability or non-annotatability, and one that's actually extremely relevant to the question of survival, is this. Would be an example of a non-annotatable paper, right? I've used not a quill pen, but a fountain pen there, and I can't write on toilet paper. It's also at this point in time probably considered extremely wasteful to do so when people are fighting over toilet paper in grocery stores. Despite its relative invisibility on the pages of our early texts, and one of the points I'm trying to make here is that we need something else to test it. We sort of one way to test it is to write on it and to leave a blot, right? So despite its relative invisibility on the pages of early texts and in our accounts of book history, sizing matters to our scholarship because it is a precondition of book annotation. And it's also a significant indicator of book survival into the present day. How then does one learn to see this unseen ingredient in handmade paper? Even Renaissance writers and readers did not trust their eyes when it came to sizing, testing it instead with their ears or their mouths. And according to this poem from Jean Henry from 1693, he writes that if you seek a surface fit for pen, first see if size sufficient it has ta'en. This is a bad translation of a bad poem anyway. The sure test of a well-sized page are these that you see up here. Shaken by hand, it does not limply sag, as is the fashion of a piece of rag, but crackles parchment-like, resisting still the holder's touch and loath to do his will. If you seek further proof, then take the sheet and licking it with spittle make it wet. If on the back no moisture trace is found, right, if it doesn't bleed through, be sure with ample glue the paper's bound. Right, so another way we think of it, it's gelatin. It's much like a glue. If it show through, the lack of size is plain. On porous paper you will write in vain. Modern readers like ourselves, unwilling to risk the scandal of being dragged from the library reading room for licking books, can use the hand and ear test. And I've brought some supplies here. One, he talks about this, it crackles parchment-like. And in fact, one thing Tim Baer says, they're trying to make imitation parchment in much the same way that Renske is pointing to this sort of continued illumination. There's the harkening back and making very, very heavy sizing. So you hear that. There's our crackle. It's a nice sized sheet of paper. And you hear this has got a little crackle to it, but it's not the same. You're going to notice as I pass these around that they don't, there's two of them that are sized and one of them that's unsized. So you'll be able to feel the difference and you'll immediately recognize, these are very much like the archival papers you're looking at. Timothy Barrett made these, shared them with me from the University of Iowa Center for the Book. So I'll pass these around and you can feel free to crackle away while we talk. It doesn't bother me. Good. So handwriting is the most visible indicator of sizing. Historical papers bearing legible clean lines that were made with water-based ink attest to the fact that the paper's porous surface has been coated in some way. Now, while handwriting is a reliable indicator of sizing, blotchy handwriting sometimes reveals a page that is poorly or unevenly sized. And we could talk, the unevenly sized is something I'd like to know more about. I think it's a place that could use a lot more research, and we could talk more about that later. But a good example of how uneven sizing affects annotatability can be seen. Well, I want to show you the Newbie Bible. Honestly, a great example of how sizing can be uneven and where it can be seen is this cover of the exhibit to In Reader's Hands, with the example that we led off with at the exhibition yesterday. You can just see that there are places where the ink is really sinking in, and it's not quite blotting, but it's blurring, and they're not clean lines. And so that's a great example. I love this poster too. The example I was going to show you that I brought with me is from the Newbie Bible. Now, I don't know if I know we have some students who you may have read. There's been reference a couple times to Peter Stallerbrass's work on discontinuous reading, and I'm not sure if that's something, books and scrolls that you've been thinking with. But Peter also uses this Bible as an example, this Newbie Bible. It's a terrific one, and it's also one where I found my first flower in a book. So it's a special sentiment for me in Psalm 91. We can see this in this 1580 Geneva Bible. It's from the Folger Shakespeare Library. It's filled with handwritten marginalia. According to Kathy Atchison, in addition to ownership marks, and here I'm quoting from the 17th century, handwritten throughout the book, the Newbie Bible has over 600 marginal notes written by Elizabeth Boggess. And by the way, Kathy Atchison is the one who's really discovered who that was. Back when Peter was writing that article, Discontinued, we didn't know who it was. Elizabeth Boggess. And Kathy writes that they record her experience of the world of Methodism in late 18th century London. In one marginal note dated November 27, 1791, just again for the sake of contrast, this is a Geneva Bible, so it's got its roots back in the 1560s. It's printed in 1580. It's Francis Newby given the book given to him by his son or by his father. Samuel Newby on the back. So we have we're looking at about 150 years of use of one Bible. Now we're with Elizabeth Boggess in 1791, where next to Psalm 119, Boggess ran into a weak spot, a blemish in the paper where the sizing was inadequate. The annotation, which is written vertically along the outer margin of the page, explains that the regular minister, you can see it here, the regular minister was, quote, at Bath on account of ill health. And basically what you could see here, just as an example, is that we hit this rough section and everything sinks in. And what you can actually see if we looked at it a little closer is that there's a repeated attempt to write the same thing, to cross it out and write the same thing. And she finally gets on well-sized ground and keeps starting over until she gets there. To write about a word that is sunk or is sinking into the page is to recall the vocabulary used by early modern writers to describe their negotiations with the variously absorbent surfaces of heterogeneous handmade paper. A 1645 pamphlet tirade against error-filled Bibles complains about the thin, spongy paper used for printing. The concern in this case is material, that's sinking paper. It talks about very coarse and extreme, thin and bad. It calls it sinking paper. Sinking paper is used as a poetic trope throughout the period as well. So sometimes it's very technical, it's sinking paper, and sometimes it's a poetic trope. A funeral sermon printed in 1626 promises that God will write our works in royal paper. Therefore, we should not, quote, let fear invade us, as if that paper could sink, and so we should lose our works. In other words, God's writing our works in good paper, so that it's very clear and not feathered and not blotted. Here God, who is at other times invoked to blot sinners' names from the book of life, is said to record good deeds so carefully that they are perfectly written. Elsewhere, sinking paper, a clergyman claims, is, quote, as able to contain the distinct impression of the letters written thereon as corrupt reason can distinguish or discern the stamp or notions of holy things. Sort of a back formation, but put another way, a corrupt mind can see truth about as clearly as one can read letters that were written on sinking paper. So it should come as no surprise that the language of blotting and of sinking paper is used in religious texts for the Protestant Reformation. And as I feel I'm learning increasingly from being here, I'm broadening my idea of what the Protestant Reformation is and how turns out, I mean, you know, it may not have been all Protestants, right? I mean, this is part of the really important work you're doing with this project. But this thrived on readerly interaction. We could say the confessional profiles, the eclectic confessional profiles thrived on readerly interaction with Bibles printed on paper. Animal sizing, a material precondition for such interaction, is what allowed, or in some cases disallowed, a reader or writer like Elizabeth Boggess to annotate her Bible. It is also the material basis, animal sizing, for a sinking paper trope that appears throughout 16th and 17th century texts, including religious treatises and printed sermons, scientific texts, school books, political pamphlets, poetry, and drama. And I just call that the sinking paper trope. It's not a great coinage, but it's one that we can see in a lot of different kinds of genres. Since we're already talking about Bibles and sermons, and since I happen to be the son of a preacher man, I'm going to structure the second half of my talk into three M's, although it'll probably be 2 M's for the sake of time. Materials and metaphors I want to talk to you about quickly, and then we may talk a little bit about methodology. So, materials. I want to talk just briefly about how does this sizing actually work, because it's not something that is as well known, and it's not talked about as much in modern scholarship. I do have a theory on this, and I think it has to do with the Bic pen, because we do find scholars from the really going back to the late 19th century thinking about sizing. There's this point at which, and this is a little bit of a crackpot theory. I cannot prove this, but I throw it out in this forum to say, if you've got ideas, I'd love to chat with you about it. This idea that suddenly when we stop thinking about absorbency of paper, we stop thinking about water-based ink that's running into and being absorbed by paper, we stop thinking about it historically, or to stop noticing it as much historically. So in really good histories of the book are really terrific considerations even of survival. So I'm sorry, Flavia Bruno couldn't be here, but like her book on lost books doesn't take into account, for instance, sizing in a really major volume on book survival on lost books. So adding sizing. So to give you a little background on how this worked, adding sizing to paper was a separate process that required a series of separate additional steps. Once we understand that the application of sizing is a non-required additional step in the papermaking process, we begin to grasp the economic significance of sizing, and therefore the potential for a degree of paper heterogeneity, that paper difference that we have not fully accounted for in the history of book scholarship. We might think of gelatin sizing as an upgrade, a value-added or premium feature. It's the premium version of the app, a feature that contributed to the enormous diversification of the book market that Andrew Pettigrew has convincingly demonstrated throughout his book, The Book in the Renaissance. Article and chapter-length discussions of animal sizing may be found in book conservation scholarship and in publications like Hand Papermaking that focus even now on the interest of papermaking artisans still working. But book history scholarship lacks a sustained consideration of animal sizing. And this is just, so what I'm saying is that there's a, just to kind of very briefly hit this one methodological part of it, is that much of what I'm telling you I learned from paper makers and hand printers. And I was told by conservators and historians of the book that you could not print on unsized paper, and it's absolutely not true, and everybody who works with papermaking and printing by hand knows this. But there was this disconnect, and so part of the methodology is just talking to other kinds of people, much like we're doing here. Really think, I have a note here, this necessity of a colloquia like this that focuses on historical book use and puts many people in conversation. The process of papermaking is illustrated especially well in Lalande's The Art of Papermaking. These are actually from Diderot's Encyclopedia, but it was based on Lalande. They're published. These are published in 1767, about 16 years after Lalande. In the image on the left, the vat man at the far left pulls sheets from the vat, and it's very small. It's a little bright here, but just you know this process: pulling sheets from the vat to be stacked and pressed, and then they're on the right. They're hung to dry. Notice the gender division of labor, but they're hung to dry on the right. And this is the way papermaking is usually depicted. This is how we talk about papermaking. You make the paper, you hang it to dry. Maybe you burnish it, but these are the two-step process. And it's absolutely not a two-step process when sizing is involved, because what we have at this stage is what we would now call, it's unsized paper, what we now call water leaf. It's blotting paper. It's going to be like that shirt with the quill in it, or the toilet paper. It also would be great for toilet paper, which is, we won't have time for survival, but that's really, this joke that things are being used for toilet paper. If you were choosing to go to the privy with either paper that's been coated with a gelatinous substance so that it won't be absorbent, or one that is absorbent, which would you choose? As it happens, that maps exactly onto what survives. If the paper was meant for writing, then it needed surface sizing. So the dried sheets of absorbent paper that were drying in this loft in the second step were gathered into small stacks and spurs and taken to the sizing room, and they were tub-sized. They were soaked in a warm gelatin solution rendered from animal bones and hides. Then the paper was pressed a second time, this time to expel excess sizing, and then it was hung to dry again, right? So we have this multiple steps here. These additional steps required additional equipment and space. In the encyclopedia, we see that the room for making paper and the room for sizing paper required similar equipment, but they were two different rooms. Vats, screw presses, and labor, 3 workers in each space. A detailed inventory of the Southampton paper mill in 1696 really argues for the accuracy of these illustrations. The drying, again, just adds a lot to it. Sizing pot ingredients, we could talk about a lot. There's a lot of discussion of it. Really, we don't know what went into the sizing pot exactly. What we kind of know is that all sorts of offal that paper makers could regularly depend upon from the sorts of parts of animal bodies that would not have been used. We hear about a lot of different solutions, but the different solutions are alike in this regard. They make visible the ways that paper making relied upon available natural resources, especially parchment leather scraps and butcher scraps. The rag and bone collector is well known from history and literature. Though most references to such a character focus on rag collection, bone collection was equally vital and is preserved in that name. And if you know the Bob Dylan song, the rag, stuck inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again, he's talking about the rag man. The lack of standard sizing recipes may well indicate that paper makers knew they could throw into the sizing pot whatever animal parts were handy. Hooves, hides, ears, horns, heads, parchment, and leather, scraps, bones, and yet it's clear that over time, sizing practices grew more sophisticated and demanding, and you begin to see a bespoke sizing industry that's looking at things like isinglass from sturgeon for sizing. If you want to know a lot more about sizing, Tim Barrett's website, Paper Through Time, has lots and lots of information, more than you get through in a couple hours, and I recommend that. Just if you search Iowa, Tim Barrett, Paper Through Time, or I'll give you the link later. While sizing rendered from various body parts of animals, a species served writers' needs, it made more work not only for paper makers but also for printers. And this is the last part of this material. Like the paper maker who had to add a series of steps to the process of paper making to produce a sheet that could accept handwriting, the printer using sized paper had to re-moisten the paper so it would go through the press. Lotta Hellinga says that because oil-based ink was used, it did not penetrate the paper to any great extent. Quote, the paper had to be dampened to melt the size if the ink was to make any mark at all. And the real point we're making here is that the sized paper is actually harder to work with when printing, not easier. So it really raises this question, why do you print on, why are they making sized paper, going through all the extra trouble to make it if it's more trouble for the printer? It definitely helps the binding, it definitely helps the survival. For our purposes, it makes a book something you can write in. Because until you have sized paper, you can't write notes in the margin. So it suggests that that reading is writing is a really important part of the reading process. I want to wrap up. Do I have a couple minutes? How close are we on time? I know we were messing with technology, so I forgot to look at the time when I started. But
yeah, you can have some more minutes if you need.
Yeah. So let me hit metaphors really quickly. Let's make sure we have time to chat. The problem with poorly sized book pages from the perspective of an end user is, much like we're looking at, is that they frustrate readerly interaction. Anticipating the problem and taking time to coat the margins of books printed on spongy paper, a reader might add marginal notes. We do have evidence of people adding their own sizing. And I want to skip over a little bit of this, but just to talk about we look at something like Helen Smith's work on the multitudinous uses of paper in early modern England. We're seeing lots of different ways of using and adapting the books, and much like coloring, this really fits well with Renska's project. We're thinking about how they're preparing these books so that they can write in them. Numerous Renaissance texts register frustration of encountering poorly sized or unsized paper. Usually I give a Shakespeare example from Falstaff. I want to end with one because we're doing the thinking about the Bibles from thinking about David, an example from David. And while I should also show you, Heather Wolf sent me an example just 2 days ago that I'd never seen. You notice that the ink is coming through, and the person writes on the bottom of this, sinks. And this one, it sinks a little. These are the smoking guns I've been looking for. And it's, thanks to Heather and the folder there. John Preston, it's a sermon series, The Saint's Submission and Satan's Overthrow, 1638. It's based on James 4:7, to resist the devil and he will flee from you. And John Preston likens the believer's heart to paper whose sizing has been compromised by moisture. Quote, "For as ink sinks into wet paper and runs abroad on it, so when the devil offers his snares to an empty heart, they enter in and foil him. But when the heart is fortified with the fullness of grace, Satan's baits cannot take hold nor enter in." A more complex and materially descriptive example of the sinking paper trope appears in David's heinous sin, 16:31. And here we have David covering up his adultery with Bathsheba by writing on the spongy paper. We see these examples over and over and over, these examples of the way that the sinking trope metaphor, the sinking paper trope becomes a poetic metaphor. I think that I just want to close by calling attention to that these metaphors, in some ways I want to skip over them because they get so complex. So I'm thinking, like, in terms of time, if I try to explain this, they're so complex. But that's kind of the point I want to make, is that this last writer, Fuller, he, and so many others who are using these complex metaphors, they understand and they believe that readers will understand. That ink really does need to sink into paper a little bit in order to make the message legible, but not too much, or else it's going to... So these complex metaphors are really relying on readers understanding them. And the fact that we look at them and don't quite understand them means we have much to learn yet. The varied references to failure of animal sizing employed across a range of 16th and 17th century texts makes visible and invisible substance with which Renaissance readers interacted on both a material and metaphorical level. When annotating, they recognized the absence of sizing as a moment of sinking. When reading with their quills at rest or without pen and ink, they understood the ways in which sinking paper is likened to the sinking feeling of unrequited love, to the staining of a sinner's soul, to impregnation, or even to the technical difficulty of, in one example, writing on a cheese. Crucially, or a cheesecloth. Crucially, then, sizing affects book functionality, and one could argue it helps to define what is indicated by the word reading. Recognizing the role of sizing, we begin to realize that we need a more detailed and more robust vocabulary to properly describe what we observe on the pages of Renaissance books. Similarly, we need to recover the vocabulary that Renaissance readers and writers used to identify the presence or absence of sizing. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Theology Research News podcast from KU Leuven's Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. Find the TRN website at theologyresearchnews.com